Hello and welcome to Skyline's first episode tonight. I'm Driti Atri. Well, we begin with a question this time. Is the world witnessing the biggest diplomatic shift in years? Well, or are we watching old alliances quietly falling apart? Because let's be honest, in the last 24 hours, headlines from Washington, New Delhi, Beijing, Tehran, Jerusalem and Paris, they have all pointed to the same direction. The global balance of power that is changing. In the meantime, the United States has suddenly dropped the word Indo from its one of the most important military commands. Our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, he has delivered a very powerful message, and that too after Indian sailors who lost their lives in the US strike. And now a very surprising debate. It is unfolding over Hezbollah, Syria, Israel, and America's role in the whole West Asia. Well, these may look like very separate stories here, but they are not. They are all connected, and tonight we connect all the dots. In the first segment, can you imagine spending maybe years building a strategic partnership? Years of diplomatic meeting, years of defense cooperation, years of military exercises, years of speeches after a free and open Indo-Pacific. And then suddenly one word disappears. Just one word. Well, sometimes one word can change everything. And this week, the United States officially announced that the Indo-Pacific Command will once again be known as Pacific Command. That's right. On paper, it may appear to be very simple administrative change, a change of name, a return to an older title, but in international politics, symbols do matter. And this symbol, it is raising serious questions in India. Do you remember the term Indo-Pacific? That was not just a geographical description. It was a strategic vision. It was meant to highlight India's growing importance in the region. Well, it reflected Washington's belief that India would play a central role in balancing China's influence across Asia. And that is why the particular decision is creating headlines, because many observers, they are asking the same question. Why now? Why remove Indo at a time when the United States continues speaking about strengthening ties with India? And the timing, that makes the story even more dramatic. Just one day earlier, our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, and Donald Trump, they had met during the G7 summit. And then suddenly came this announcement. But dear critics, for them, the whole move, it sends a wrong message. For supporters, it is simply a return to historical tradition. The Pentagon insists that the change honors the command's route dating back to 1947. Officials argue that the mission, it remains exactly the same. The area of responsibility, it remains the same. Military cooperation remains the same. But let's be honest, perception often matters as much as reality, right? And then came another controversy. An official map displayed by the command reportedly showed Pakistan-occupied Kashmir as part of Pakistan. That immediately it triggered concern, because territorial maps, they are among the most sensitive issues in international diplomacy. Now here, one inaccurate map, it can create weeks of controversy. One mistake can trigger political outrage, and one image, it can dominate headlines across the globe. Now for India, the issue goes far beyond military terminology here. It is about recognition. It is about strategic importance, and it is about whether Washington still views New Delhi as the central pillar of its Asian strategy. Well, for now, officials are just trying to calm the concern here, but questions do remain. Because when symbols change, people start looking for deeper meaning here. And yes, that brings us to our next story, because while diplomats debated maps and military commands here, Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi, he delivered a message that carried a very different kind of weight. A message about lives lost, a message about Indian sailors, and a message heard directly by the US President, Mr. Donald Trump. Because diplomacy is one thing here, but the loss of Indian lives, that is something entirely different. Well, thousands of kilometers away from home, there were Indians who were working abroad on a commercial vessel. They were just doing their job, supporting their families. And suddenly, they found themselves trapped in the middle of a geopolitical conflict. Well, that was the nightmare scenario for 3 Indian sailors. Well, ladies and gentlemen, days ago, a US strike on a merchant vessel near Oman, it resulted in the death of 3 Indians. 3 families devastated, 3 lives lost. 3 reminders that global conflict often affect ordinary people who have nothing to do with politics. And at the G7 outreach session in France, Mr. Modi, he addressed an issue that rarely dominates the international headlines, but it affects millions of people around the globe. Maritime security, sea route, in fact, global shipping and the safety of those who work at the sea. Standing alongside world leader including Mr. Trump, Mr. Modi made it clear that maritime routes, well, that must remain safe and secure. Because behind every cargo ship is a crew, behind every shipment is a family, and behind every maritime worker is a human story. Think about it. Nearly everything we use travels through global shipping, energy, food, raw material. The modern economy, it depends on those sea lanes. Yet the people operating these routes, they often remain invisible until a tragedy strikes. That is why Mr. Modi's remark, that remains significant. They were not simply about one accident or incident. They were about larger principle that seafarers should not become casualties of geopolitical disputes, and that commercial shipping, it should not become collateral damage, and that global powers have a responsibility to protect maritime stability. The message, it was diplomatic, but it was also personal. Because for India, the issue is not theoretical. Indian sailors work across international shipping networks. Thousands of families depend on these jobs. Every disruption affects real people. Every conflict creates real risk, and every attack raises difficult questions about accountability. Well, Mr. Modi's message reflected a growing concern shared by many countries. How do you protect global trade route when regional tensions continue rising? How do you ensure safety to other people, specifically in Strait of Hormuz? And how do you prevent ordinary workers from paying the price for geopolitical rivalry? Well, these are the questions the world still struggles to answer. And while world leaders discuss those challenges, another unexpected development is creating fresh debate in the whole West Asia. Because a surprising disagreement appears to be emerging between Washington and Jerusalem. And who's at the center of this debate? Hezbollah. That's right. For years, the United States and Israel appeared united, and that too on one issue specifically, Hezbollah. Both nations viewed the group as a major security challenge. Both countries supported efforts to limit its influence, and both the countries frequently coordinated their positions. But now, something appears to be changing. That is really uncomfortable. Ladies and gentlemen, reports suggest that Mr. Trump has become increasingly frustrated with Israel's action in Lebanon. That's right. Reports indicate growing differences between Washington and Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu. And suddenly, analysts, they are asking a question that would have sounded impossible just few months ago. Well, is a gap opening between America and Israel? If that gap is actually real, it could have major consequences because alliances are built on trust. And when disagreements emerge publicly, they do attract attention. Well, according to reports, Mr. Trump has suggested that Syria should play a larger role in dealing with Hezbollah. That idea has surprised many observers here because for years the focus was on limiting Hezbollah through pressure and deterrence. And now discussions appear to be moving in a different direction here. And this is where Iran enters the whole picture. Ladies and gentlemen, some analysts believe that Tehran never expected to defeat its opponent militarily. Instead, they argued that Iran's strategy focused on creating political division among its rivals. And if that was the goal, recent developments are generating intense debate. Because every single disagreement between the allies, it creates opportunity for the adversary. Every diplomatic dispute creates uncertainty, and every sign of division, it attracts global attention. At the very same time, supporters of diplomacy, they argue that disagreements are kind of normal here. They say allies do not need to agree on everything. They argue that differences in strategy do not necessarily mean a breakdown in relationship, and perhaps they are right. But perception cannot be ignored, specifically in West Asia. Well, a place where Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, and regional governments, including Israel, they all lie. That is why the story matters. Not because a final break has occurred, but because questions are being asked. Questions about America's priority, questions about Israel's future strategy, and questions about how the next phase of West Asia diplomacy will unfold. Because when allies they start debating publicly, everyone pays attention. And in West Asia, even a small diplomatic shift, it can produce a lot of consequences. But if you do think that geopolitical surprises end there, think again, because China has now entered the conversation and Beijing is sending a warning that could reshape the entire debate over the Iran-US deal. Well, for months, the world has focused on three major players in this crisis: the US, Iran, Israel. But now, another powerful country is stepping forward, China. And Beijing is making it clear that it has a take in what is happening. Well, this week, Chinese officials publicly called for the immediate restoration of safe navigation through Strait of Hormuz. On the surface, that may sound like a routine diplomatic statement. But look closer, and a much bigger story begins to emerge. Strait of Hormuz, that's not just another waterway. It is one of the most important energy corridors on Earth. Millions of barrels of oil passes through it every day. Energy markets depend on it, global trade depend on it, entire economies depend on it. And China knows that better than anybody else. As one of the world's largest energy importer, Beijing cannot afford instability in that particular region. Well, every disruption affects supply chain. Every escalation affects market. Every conflict affects economic growth. And that is why China is paying close attention to the Iran-US negotiations. But Beijing went even further here. Chinese officials revealed that their own vessels are operating in the region and pledged to protect their safety. In other words, China is no longer behaving like a distant observer. It is behaving like a direct stakeholder, and that changes the whole equation. Because West Asia is no longer just about regional powers here. It is becoming a stage where global powers are competing for influence. And now, Beijing is warning against actions that could derail diplomacy here. Well, the message is quite simple. China wants stability. China wants open trade route, and China wants the deal to survive here. But while Beijing pushes for diplomacy, a different battle is unfolding inside the White House itself. Because not everybody in Washington appears to agree with Mr. Trump's Iran strategy. And yes, that disagreement, that is becoming impossible to hide now. Well, the US has been spending months negotiating a major international agreement. US is calling it a breakthrough. US is telling the world that peace is within reach, and then US discovered that some of its own officials, they are not convinced. That situation is unfolding inside White House. Ladies and gentlemen, according to reports, a growing power struggle is taking place behind closed doors as the Iran deal moves closer to the reality. At the center of the debate is Mr. Pete Hegseth. He is the defense minister of the United States. Reports suggest that Mr. Hegseth has raised concern about several parts of the agreement. Well, questions about uranium enrichment, questions about inspection, question about how the deal addresses Iran's regional influence. And yes, he is not alone here. Other national security officials are also reportedly expressing reservations here. Well, their concern is simple though. Can Iran be trusted? Can inspections work? And will this particular agreement actually prevent future crises or not? Well, supporters of the deal, they argue that diplomacy is always imperfect. They say no agreement satisfies everybody. They say compromise is part of negotiations. But critics, they remain skeptical because history has taught them to be cautious. And now that disagreement, it is becoming public. Well, that matters because division inside an administration, it can weaken confidence in a policy. Allies notice it, rivals notice it, market notice it, and the biggest disagreement becomes the hardest to control. For now, Mr. Trump appears determined to push forward. But the reports, that raise an important question. What happens when the biggest challenge to a diplomatic deal comes not from foreign governments but from your own team? And yes, While Washington deals with internal tension, another controversy is exploding between America and one of Israel's most controversial politicians. Diplomatic disputes that do not always involve missiles. Sometimes they involve visas. And that is exactly what appears to have happened with Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. Ben-Gvir, he planned to visit Miami, a routine trip, or at least that was supposed to be. But instead, the visit, it became an international news. Reports suggest that Mr. Gvir, he faced additional scrutiny during a visa process, including biometric requirements and further vetting procedure. Eventually, the trip was cancelled and immediately speculations exploded. Was this standard procedure or was Washington sending a message? That question matters because Mr. Ben-Gvir, he is one of the most controversial figures in Israeli politics. Well, his critics accuse him of promoting divisive policies. His supporters argue that he is defending Israeli security. Either way, he has become one of the key figures. And that means even a visa issue, it quickly turns into a diplomatic story. Well, for some observers here, the whole incident reflects growing tension between sections of American and Israeli political establishment. But for others, it is simply bureaucracy, but perception. Once again, it matters a lot. Because in politics, people often pay more attention to symbolism than paperwork. And the symbolism here, that's powerful. A senior Israeli minister unable to complete a planned US visit. Well, at a time when questions are already being raised about the future of US-Israel relationship. The timing, it could hardly be more sensitive here, right? And yes, speaking of sensitive issues here, Israel is now making another claim. One that reaches far beyond the West Asia. What if the consequences of October 7th attack, they are no longer limited to West Asia? What if the effects, they are spreading far beyond Israel, Gaza and Lebanon? That is the warning that is coming from Israel's ambassador to India. That's right, India. According to the envoy, Israel has been monitoring what it believes to be Hamas-linked activity in Pakistan and Bangladesh. The claim is significant because it suggests concern about extremist networks. They are no longer confined to one region. Instead, they may be spreading across multiple countries. The ambassador argues that the extremist organization could view the October 7th attack as a model for future operations elsewhere. And that possibility, it is creating concern. Not just for Israel though, but for countries, including countries in South Asia. The envoy says Israel has many concern with Indian authorities and encourage continued cooperation on security issues. And now these claims are likely to generate debate. Some will argue that they highlight a growing security challenge. Others will question the evidence. But one thing is certain here, the issue has now entered the diplomatic conversation. And whenever this particular word, extremism or regional security, it appears, well, it becomes part of a discussion and it grabs attention from the globe because the consequences, it can extend far beyond the borders. And if Israel's concern, it proved correct, the whole implication could be significant for the entire region. And yes, that is not the only warning coming from Israeli officials here. Another one involves missiles. And according to Israel, those missiles could reach much farther than anyone can ever imagine. Can you imagine hearing a foreign official say that missiles deployed in the whole West Asia could potentially reach your city? That is exactly what happened this week. Israel's deputy foreign minister, he issued a stark warning about Iran's missile capabilities. According to her, Iran's ballistic missiles have the range to reach not only Israel, but also cities such as London, Mumbai or New Delhi. Well, the whole statement immediately attracted a lot of attention because it expands the conversation far beyond West Asia. Suddenly, it is not just an Iran-Israel issue, it becomes a global security issue. Well, the Israeli minister argued that countries outside the region should pay close attention to Iran's missile program because its capabilities extend well beyond neighboring states. Well, she also defended Israel's military action, saying no country would remain passive if repeatedly attacked. The comments highlight a larger reality here. Security threats today rarely remain confined to one region. Missiles travel further, Technology spreads faster, and geopolitical tensions increasingly have global consequences. Whether one agrees with Israel's assessment or not, the warning has kind of succeeded in attracting international headlines. And it serves as a reminder that outcome of the Iran negotiations could affect countries far beyond West Asia. But after all these stories of diplomacy, military tension, and geopolitical rivalries, our final story tonight, well, it reminds us of something that is terrifying. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine driving home late at night. Traffic is moving very normally. Everything seems routine. And then suddenly you see flames. You see smoke, you see an aircraft laying on the side. And in an instant, ordinary people, they became heroes. That's right, that's exactly what happened on a highway in Texas. A small plane crashed and caught fire. Chaos erupted. Drivers, they stopped their vehicle. People rushed towards the wreckage. And what happened next? It looked like something from a movie scene. Here, witnesses describe seeing passengers trapped inside. People began trying to smash the cockpit window. Others ran towards the burning aircraft despite the danger. Everybody understood the risk here. The fire could spread. The plane could explode. But they acted anyway. Eventually, survivors managed to escape. Lives were saved and strangers, they became rescuers. Sadly, one person lost his life, but the story, it could have been much, much worse. You know what makes this whole incident remarkable is not the crash itself, it is the response. Ordinary people refusing to stand by. Ordinary people risking their own lives, their own safety to help others. In a world often dominated by stories of conflict, division and politics, this story reminds us of something different. Humanity, courage and the instinct just to help somebody in need. Because sometimes the biggest headlines, they are not about governments or world leaders. Sometimes they are about ordinary people doing their ordinary things. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we followed a world in transition. America dropping Indo from a major military command. PM Modi, his message about the death of Indian sailors, growing questions about the US-Iran relationship, China's warning over the Iran deal, tension inside Trump administration, a diplomatic controversy involving Ben Gvir, and claims about Hamas activity in South Asia with warnings about Iran's missile capabilities, and finally, a dramatic rescue on a Texas highway. Stories are different countries, different headlines, but all connected by just one reality. The world is changing, and every decision being made today, it could shape tomorrow's headlines. Thank you for joining me on Skyline. I'm Driti Atri, and I'll see you in the next episode.